This is another question that I asked Deputy Attorney General Bill Stokes about, and he dismissed it very quickly. He said, well, Al must have somehow known that those weren't the girls' footprints.
Yeah, overall the state's attitude has been that the state didn't make a mistake and in fact doesn't make these kinds of mistakes at all. They have consistently through the whole history of this case claimed that everything they did was correct, appropriate, that the correct verdict was reached, and that the state of Maine does not make mistakes like all the other states do.
Well, Jim, this one is a question pretty much for you. I don't think we've said this before, but you're a retired ATF agent, that's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and you have an extensive history as being one of the lead investigators in northern New England, and you've obviously investigated murders and kidnappings and such in the past. So just how would you rate Detective Hensby as a detective?
Well, investigation, no matter what crime you're investigating, there are certain procedures, certain things you do as an investigator. Corporal Al Hensby, that's what he was at the time. He was 39 years old. He'd been with the state police for 18 years. He'd been a detective for about 3 years. He had attended a couple seminars on homicide investigation. His personnel file doesn't reflect that he ever headed any major investigation. He had some commendations for being polite when he issued traffic summonses. He had some commendations for assisting in some large police efforts on various things. But he had no recognition for anything important or running any important investigation. He was certain from the beginning, it's quite obvious, from the fact that Dennis's name was found in the driveway, he was certain that he had a ground ball here. And this is an easy case. All we have to do now is prove that this guy did it. And he tended to ignore evidence, to quit looking for any other evidence. I began my inquiry into this assuming that Hensby might be misled, he might be mistaken, but he was being truthful. He was telling the truth as he knew it. He keeps saying things like, I really liked Dennis DeShane. I was hoping it had been anybody but him. I liked this guy. And yet he never interrogated any other suspect. He never interrogated Senecal. He never tried to interview Fickett, who he knew to be a child molester and who was eventually convicted of a crime that Hensby had been investigating at the time. He tried to link Dennis to some murders in the state of Washington that had occurred when Dennis was going to college out there. And Hensby tells people now that, well, those detectives out in Washington didn't want to solve that crime. But the fact is, when you get the evidence and you get the files, you find that he was suggesting Dennis as the perpetrator of these unsolved murders out there. And finally, the state of Washington detectives asked, what blood type is Dennis DeShane? And Hensby told them Dennis's blood type, at which point the Washington detectives had nothing else, no further interest. That would tell me that whoever perpetrated their murder had a different blood type, but it didn't tell Hensby that. Hensby says they didn't want to solve the crime. He said that on film to somebody. And then he said the state of Maine didn't want to send me out there to solve their crime for them. And then Hensby says, now Dennis DeShane had the keys to his truck with him, and his truck was locked, and nobody could have unlocked his truck without the keys, or no one could have locked it without the keys. So Dennis DeShane had to have locked the truck because he had the keys and that's the only way you can lock the truck. But yet, there is a report by Hensby, a written report, stating that he has tested the lock on that truck and you can lock it with the key or by pressing the button down and closing the door. So why does he keep saying that you had to have the key and therefore Dennis had to be the one that locked his truck? I no longer believe that Mr. Hensby is always sticking to the truth.
Jim, you mentioned that recent interview that you saw given by Hensby on tape. In that interview, didn't he also say that Dennis's DeShane's truck tires were found, tire marks were found in the driveway, when in fact the report by the state police tire experts excluded 3 of the tires from possibly having been on Dennis's truck, and merely said that 1 tire was consistent with the tire that was on Dennis's truck.
The prosecutor, Eric Wright, said that to the newspaper when he was defending his actions, say, well, he said, quote, well, if anybody can explain how Dennis DeShane's tire tracks were in that driveway, then maybe, maybe he didn't do it. But there's no testimony that his tire tracks were there. The state police expert testified that the tracks in the driveway were consistent with one of Dennis's tires. And the expert for the state also said that they're also consistent with any other tire with a similar tread design.
Throughout this whole trial process, how do you figure Prosecutor Wright's behavior fit in?
I didn't attend the trial, so I can't really speak from first-hand experiences other than having read a certain amount of the transcript and also read the accounts in Jim's book. But I do recall seeing several years ago on Channel 6, Susan Kimball was interviewing Eric Wright about the DNA evidence, which is a very important part of this case. Of course, Sarah was strangled, and victims of strangulation reflexively scratch the strangler. And there was mixed blood found under her fingernails, and this is which Dennis wanted tested for DNA before the trial. And I recall Eric Wright responded to that by saying that the DNA was of no significance because Dennis DeShane had no scratches on him. And I remember thinking, did I just hear that?
Well, it's a little like saying pay no attention to the bullet holes in the victim because the guy I arrested didn't have a gun. It's kind of silly. The DNA is interesting because Dennis himself requested DNA tests before the trial, which is certainly unheard of for a guilty person to do. And the state prevented him from getting the DNA tests. Then after the trial, several years after the trial, his attorney succeeded in having Sarah Cherry's fingernails tested for DNA. And they came out with the DNA of 2 persons. Some of Sarah Cherry's own DNA was under her nails, and the DNA of another person, who was not Dennis DeShane. Dennis DeShane was excluded. At that time, Deputy Attorney General Stokes said, oh, well, it was probably a dog she petted or the girl she was babysitting. Well, then subsequent DNA tests were done, and they were more refined, and they found that the mystery DNA was that of a male person. So it wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a girl she was babysitting. But Mr. Stokes was ready with another excuse. It was probably the DNA of somebody in her family. So all the male members of her family were tested and excluded. It wasn't them. And then he said, well, it was probably one of the officers that transported the body to the morgue. And they were all tested and excluded, and it wasn't them. And then Mr. Stokes said it was probably somebody in the medical examiner's office, one of those doctors' DNA got under her nails, and they were all tested and excluded. But now Mr. Stokes, whose imagination is extremely rich, says that what it was probably DNA left on the nail clippers from a previous corpse, because the medical examiner's office is such a pig pen that they never wash anything. And that's his conclusion now. The DNA doesn't matter because it probably came from a previous corpse.
In a lot of ways, this seemed like a classic recutting of the puzzle pieces to fit what they wanted to make fit. And that's what all of us at the time of the case thought. That was the reason that we started trial and error in the first place. Was it became obvious to us through the trial process, especially with the verdict, that what law enforcement had done was taken the available evidence and reworked it, recut it, and refigured it so that it pointed to one conclusion.
when talking about evidence, Steve, then there's also the case of the rape kit and a couple of hairs that were found on the corpse, which the state incinerated 6 days after Dennis's lawyers filed for a motion for a new trial. This is potential DNA evidence. If it's possible that if this evidence had been preserved, we would not even be here today. But the state destroyed that evidence. As a matter of fact, Steve, right, that's a good point. They, although they got rid of these 2 hairs and the swab, they kept Dennis's sneakers. And the question you have to ask them, if they didn't have room to store 2 hairs and a swab, why couldn't they have just put them in one of the sneakers?
Just to straighten it out in my mind for a second, wasn't there pieces of evidence found at the scene that would connect Dennis to the murder?
Oh yeah, yeah. According to the papers with Dennis's name on them were found in the driveway of the house from which Sarah was abducted. And according to the state's theory, apparently, those papers fell out of his truck while he was pushing the girl in, I suppose. The odd thing about that is that the state inventoried everything in that truck. Dennis gave them his permission to tow it to Augusta and search it for evidence. And they inventoried everything and they found 178 items in there that did not have his name on them. But apparently the only 2 to fall out had his name on them. That seems pretty odd to me. And you start thinking about that. Why did those papers end up there in that driveway? Why were ropes from his truck used to tie the victim? Why was a scarf from his truck used to strangle her? This is all strong evidence. Well, think about the crime. Now, I'm not an expert on this type of murder by any means, but I have spoken to experts and I have read textbooks on it. And I know that the type of creature who commits this terrible crime, kidnapping, torturing a little girl and strangling her to death, this is not his first crime. This isn't the first crime this guy's committed, not the first sexual deviance he's shown. The person who's done this, according to all the experts, has a long history that started probably with window peeping and torturing little animals, perhaps. And what that leads you to believe, logically, is that whoever did this is someone whose past deeds have made him known to the police. And he feels that he will be suspected when this crime is discovered. And his natural urge is, well, if they're going to suspect me, I better give them somebody else to suspect. And here is a truck with nobody in it, and I will take these things out and I will use them to frame whoever owns that truck and divert the police from thinking about me. Well, if that's what happened, and that seems just as logical as, more logical to me than that DeShane dropped the only 2 items with his name on them at the driveway. If that's what happened, it worked. The police bid on it and made up their mind at that moment that DeShane was their man and never turned back.
And I think we need to remember too that the state police, in the process of inventorying everything in the truck, looked for any sign that the victim might have been in that truck and found absolutely nothing. Not a hair, no sign at all, no scent. They used, I believe, scent dogs to check the truck. There was absolutely no sign that the victim was ever in that truck.